some water. Good afternoon, everyone. I think it's afternoon now, right? Welcome if you're tuning in now. I'm Ashley Furlong, a healthcare reporter at POLITICO. As you heard, we're going to be speaking about pandemic preparedness. As we discuss this, at the World Health Organization, countries are negotiating what could be the most consequential changes to the global health rules ever made. It's also clear, as we've heard from earlier today, that these crises aren't going away. While the world was dealing with COVID, we saw monkeypox, or mpox, start to spread around the globe. And now we have rising concern about dengue. And there's also the looming threat of avian influenza. And there's not just the pandemic treaty being discussed. CEPI is working on its 100 days mission. Pharmaceutical companies are individually working on vaccines for diseases with pandemic potential. And in Brussels, HERA is working to ensure the EU is ready. Just a few housekeeping remarks before we get going. You can ask questions through the Swap Card platform. And if you're in the room, you can scan the QR code on the screens. Or if you're online, check the instructions on the event website. And please do tweet or use X to engage with us. We have a fantastic panel to speak about these issues today. Next to me, we have Roland Dries, Director of International Affairs at the Netherlands Ministry of Health and co-chair of the Intergovernmental Negotiating Body for the Pandemic Accord. Next to him, we have Saul Walker, Head of Public Partnerships at the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations, or CEPI, as we all know it. And we have Eloise Todd, Executive Director of Pandemic Action Network. I'm going to get right into the discussions and start with talking a bit about the treaty. The latest draft was released last week, as I'm sure you all know. Roland, it's taken a lot of work to get to the stage, and we're going to get into the content in a little bit, but it seems an impossible task to find consensus. I'm wondering if you are regretting agreeing to take up this role so many months ago.
Is it working? Yeah, you can hear me? Yes, you can. It is a challenging task, that it is, and a lot of work needs to be done before we all agree to what's on the table. But do I regret taking it on? No, not at all, actually, because I believe that it's a very useful thing, and I don't mind investing a lot of my time in it when there is a chance that we improve the world a little bit. I mean, I'm realistic enough to understand that this is not a major holdover, that everybody is going to do everything which we have put on paper. But if we do already a little, then I would be happy, and it would not be a waste of my time at all.
On that point, I'm wondering, there's been some concern now with the latest draft that we might end up with a treaty that doesn't say much at all, that doesn't really change the status quo. Is that something that you're concerned about?
Yes, because if we come up in the end with something that doesn't change anything at all, then we could just as well not have done it, because that we already have. And the task of a chair of such an instrument and such a negotiation process is not easy, because there's 200 countries out there and a multitude of organizations around that give their input and share their ideas and often want something else than the other one. So you have to balance that all and try to come up with something that reflects the needs, because that's the basis of everything, but also takes into account what you hear, what is realistic in that sense. So I hope that we did the right thing, but we will hear in 2 weeks from all the member states.
Eloise, I'm wondering, you've been following these discussions very closely for many months. What are you most concerned about as we get to what is now the final couple of months before we're supposed to be agreeing this all in May next year?
Thank you. I think the main concern from all of us at Pandemic Action Network, which for those of you that don't know is a civil society network of over 350 organisations around the world, we are concerned that political leaders are not going to understand the once-in-a-lifetime opportunity of this pandemic treaty. There are negotiators like Roland working really hard. There are health ministries fully engaged. But pandemics, as we experienced, are a whole of society, whole of government issue. and the sacrifices that were made by so many people, we really owe it to ourselves and the world, and particularly to those in low and middle income countries, to get this right. And so we have to go beyond the kind of usual boundaries of negotiating and zero sum. We have to, as painful as it is, understand what we need to do and go back to all of those lessons learned from COVID, which I think psychologically people don't want to remember. And obviously we're living in the times that we're living in with so much going on in the world, but it's our job to keep the pandemic accord at the top of the political agenda and to make sure governments engage way beyond the health ministries as well.
Thanks, Eloise. And Saul, I mentioned CEPI's big 100 days mission. And for those of you who don't know, this is the aim to have a vaccine ready within 100 days of a new pandemic sort of arriving. And it's part of a sort of broader mission that the G20 backs. But we saw last week with the new treaty text come out, the International Pharma Lobby said that the current treaty text won't actually allow that mission to be met. Saul, I'm wondering, what conditions do you think need to be in the treaty to enable you to be able to effectively meet that target?
Thanks. Is this working?
No.
Does that work? Yeah. So we learned from COVID a number of things that needed to be in place to move fast. We saw that lots of often public sector investment in many years of R&D, development around mRNA or around the Oxford vaccine construct and on MERS really helped us move fast on COVID vaccines. We saw where there were partnerships and trust between manufacturers that you could scale up incredibly rapidly. We saw regulators move more quickly to accelerate the approval of vaccines, although still some bottlenecks in some areas. And we saw the importance of having rapid finance available to support procurement, to get vaccines to all communities, and that those things are really important. So I guess my question around the pandemic accord is, how can member states, and the accord is aimed at member states, how can the accord help create the partnerships and the trust between those different parties, both the sectors, but also different countries, different regions, to help move those things forwards? I mean, from CEPI's perspective, sort of ongoing investment in preparedness R&D is really crucial. Thinking about how we maybe leverage some of that investment, which will come from public sector, in including access and thinking about how we support that and in some of the conditions that we have. And CEPI has done that very successfully with a range of companies that have wanted to support access as well as drive forwards their innovation. And how do we look at the issues around regulation and investment in manufacturing and R&D capacities across the world? And there are new there's new language in the accord on that. And if we can bring all of those pieces to the table, then actually we can change some of the dynamics around sharing risk, costs and benefits. And we really need to get to some kind of approach around system equity that recognises what those different parties bring to the table.
And on that public funding for R&D, there's been some concern that the treaty doesn't include sort of direct access conditions linked to public funding. Eloise, I'm wondering, given this importance of R&D in a pandemic, and everyone acknowledges that, and the desire for the next pandemic not to be one of charity, what provisions do you think need to be attached to that public funding? Should there be something in the treaty text about that?
Yes, we believe that we need to have a very different approach if we are to get beyond the charity model that we saw during COVID. Now, of course, European Union member states, the European Commission, different organisations in this room, foundations, came together, and CEPI indeed came together and did what they could and built the Access to COVID Tools Accelerator. However, there were some structural issues there. It meant that they couldn't necessarily compete with rich countries. So there's a fundamental set of issues here that actually go beyond the IP debate. How do you get equitable access to contracts? How do you sort out who decides who's next in the queue? We know the realpolitik. We know that if you're a country with a pharmaceutical manufacturer in your domain, you probably have first rights of access. We need to talk about these issues as well, as the other issues around IP. And I would also say that related to this, we have to fight the next battle, not the last one. There's a lot of talk, for example, about day zero financing. Now, the European Union, its mandate is to protect its people. I'm a proud European citizen and understand that. However, if we've got the EU and the US and other rich countries buying tools in advance of even knowing what the disease is, we've got like contracts being made for disease X. So day zero is already late. So we have to think about these things and think about how we build a construct that will not see a new structural inequity. And I would urge our European countries and all of the rich countries at the table to think about connecting the dots. Geopolitics suffered because of the inequities during COVID, and we cannot now debate the accord as if it's a technocratic health issue. It's much more than that, and we have to take it seriously no matter what else is going on in the world.
And beyond the treaty, so CEPI obviously has within its power, it can actually make decisions on including those access provisions, when it's sort of funding new products. I'm wondering, have you, since the pandemic, reconsidered about your sort of access provisions, and can you explain a little bit about how those discussions are going?
So we've been very lucky. We've worked with some fantastic private sector partners, and the negotiations will vary depending on the company, depending on the area of focus, depending on where they are in their development program. But in the past, we've worked primarily with biotechs, but we are beginning to put in place agreements with larger companies. We've just signed something with biotech, working on mpox as a first area. We've worked with Oxford University on taking forward more work on their viral vector platform, which allows work across a range of different pathogens. So we are beginning to build those out. In all instances, right from the start with our discussions, is we think about access and how we might be able to achieve that in a way that works for both parties. And sometimes that will be around agreements on transferring technology. We've just done this with Valneva and chikungunya, which they're working on sort of a US and travel market. We're working with them and with partners in Latin America to do trials and then transfer that technology for production in Latin America. So there are opportunities there to work in different ways. Or it may be on looking at issues around pricing and other mechanisms. So we cut our cloth a little bit depending on the technologies and the organizations that we're working with, but recognizing we both bring things to the discussion, to the table that we want to work on. That broader piece around the environment into which those discussions take place, I think, is important. If there were more focus, I think, from public sector funders on also thinking about what are the opportunities to include access in some of the work that's being funded either at an early stage or in product development, that would also help in terms of sort of setting access as something that's expected as part of these discussions, but recognizing still that you will need to come up with different terms and different approaches depending on whom you're working with.
Thanks, Saul. And Eloise mentioned intellectual property. Roland, I'm going to put this question to you. So we saw, I think it was just last week, the German health minister basically make a red line regarding the pandemic treaty and on intellectual property rights, saying that if there's strong sort of provisions, that's sort of a no-go area for them. Is it helpful to be hearing red lines now?
What will I say about that? I'm the chair of a process in which I have to make some neutrality and some objectivity. So it's better not to react on individual ministers, I think, what they said. But in general, every country has its own lines, of course, and that's nothing wrong with that. The only question every country will need to answer for themselves is, now let's put it differently. I think that it's important that we read very carefully what's on paper now before we use strong terms and make the negotiations complicated. Nobody is saying for IP, for example, that IP should be gone. No, it is reckoned that IP is a very powerful and important tool in developing new products. That's a given from the start. And the only thing that's on the table is when there really is a pandemic and we're really lacking access to products in parts of the world, would it be then considerable that you encourage or try to or work with companies to give up under certain circumstances a little bit of your protection for a limited period of time in order to create more production of products you need in a pandemic? Because what we should not forget is that a German minister can, for example, say this now, and I fully understand where it comes from because there's a strong industry behind that. But it could also be China who's got the product next time and the IP next time. And are we then still so confident that things will play out for themselves? So I think it's important that we keep on reading what we try to do. And if countries do not like that, well, there's a negotiation. You can always change things. But nobody is saying get rid of all the IP, at least not the people who put this part on the table. Because we all understand the importance of the industry and of IP, but there could be circumstances in which you have to look at everything. I mean, we could not even imagine that we would close schools, that we would close shops, or that people had to be confined in their homes. So in times of pandemics, all kinds of issues come at the table which we could not imagine before. Well, maybe, and that's up to the member states, of course, looking at IP under circumstances could be one of those things that you would in normal conditions not do, but in a pandemic you might.
Mm-hmm. And the role of the INB is not to obviously tell countries what to do, it's to help them have those discussions.
Yes.
With so many conflicting proposals on the table and very different opinions, how do you decide what goes in and what goes out?
Well, firstly, we started with a white paper, and we asked everybody, mainly the countries, but also non-governmental organizations, industry partners, what do you think should be included? And I think that the strong point of what we have on the table is that it is about prevention, it is about preparedness, and it is about response. So the whole cycle that you need. Firstly, we want to invest in not having pandemics at all. At the same time, we work on when we have them, for example, the work of CEPI, that we would easily be able to come up with the right products. And then lastly, the response side, how do you make sure that you can, if you have those problems and you have the products to address it, how do you make sure it gets to the people who need it most at the right time? Mm. That's what we try to do. And so all those elements are included now in a way in a text of which we feel that there is a balance in the text, that it reflects the needs and the wishes of different groups in the room, so to say, because American, European countries might have a different perspective than African countries, and it should be something that contains a solution for both. I'm not saying that we are very wise people, because we are just people, but I think we listened well, and we think we came up with something which is balanced. And the fact that a lot of people are saying, well, that a lot of people are having criticism about the text, well, mainly might mean that we found the right balance.
Eloise, one of the key asks from organizations like yours and from the former heads of the independent panel is for financing and enough money. You spoke about this. I'm wondering, what would you like to see here in the pandemic treaty text? Like, what does this look like? Are we talking actual? Would you like to see actual dollar sums in the pandemic treaty for certain instruments that are being proposed? What would you like to see around financing?
I think the financing question still needs to be worked out. We have a whole landscape across what's become quite a complex global health set of architecture. We need to make sure that different pieces of the architecture already work. So a pandemic fund was set up last year. It needs 10.5 billion a year. It's nudging towards 2. We desperately need that to be fulfilled, for example. There are the separate but related talks about a surge financing mechanism, which I already alluded to. Where should that sit? How should that relate to this other thing? We need a fully financed CEPI to be able to do the R&D and that urgent work and have the libraries of vaccines available so that we can leapfrog some of those early issues. So I think that some of the hard yards on what financing should look like within the Accord still need to be actually worked out. And we need to make sure that the global architecture is fully funded, but crucially, that countries can have what they need to invest in their domestic national infrastructure. And actually, if you read the Accord, so much of it is about strengthening health systems, strengthening laboratory systems, putting up clinical trials networks that can lead to a different form of equity in terms of how we're doing our research. So some of it is about pandemic-specific spending, absolutely, but actually a lot of it is about getting that financing through all sorts of different channels and ratcheting this right up the political agenda so that health isn't a nice to have. It's an absolutely urgent geopolitical necessary for us all.
On financing, and a bit more broadly, we saw the recent replenishments for CEPI, for Gavi, for Global Fund, increasing pressure on countries saying, well, we just can't give what we gave last time, or we can't give what you need. I'm wondering, Saul, are you concerned when we come around to those replenishments in the next few years that there's going to be even more pressure? We have so many crises in Europe, for example, at the moment, and so many asks on sort of